Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Ichigo and Hallow Yoruichi married and have kids? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the METALCHICKCRISIS2040 for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. Let's start this video. Ichigo sighed, resting his in the palm of his hand as he stared out of his classroom window. He had long forgotten the teacher's rambling, blocking him out. His eyes gazed at the darkening sky, clouds forming rapidly. Slowly, tiny droplets of water began falling from the sky. Ichigo found himself in this. Such a thing as simple as rain caught his very interest. His thought suddenly wandered to the Soul Society, his eyes growing distant once again. He'd been successful in rescuing Rukia, but somehow he felt uneasy. Ever since he left Soul Society, his life seemed empty. An image of golden eyes passed through his head, and for a moment his eyes widened. Those eyes again, he thought, narrowing his own eyes. Golden eyes. He searched through his mind, trying to match those eyes with a face. Day after day since his return, that's all he could see when he closed his eyes, a pair of golden voids. He concentrated, staring directly at the sky. Suddenly, it dawned on him. Yoruichi. He said aloud, lifting his head from his hand. He could see an image of her in the sky, created by his own mind's eye. Yoruichi scowled, her power rising as she fought a Hallow a few blocks down from Ichigo's school. She too had been thinking of him and decided she would pay him a visit. That is, until the Hallow made its fancy appearance. Doing a backhand spring, Yoruichi landed on one knee, balling her fist as she called forth her spirit energy. Blue wind whirled around her fist, blowing her hair around wildly. The rain started to pour on them, and as the rain fell more, her power grew. She stood, waiting for the Hallow to attack. The Hallow, however, disappeared. Baffled, Yoruichi let her power slip, looking around. What the hell? She took a step forward, about to take another when something grabbed her ankle. She looked down, her eyes widening. The Hallow grabbed both of her ankles, effectively holding her still as another Hallow appeared in front of her. She went to punch, but another Hallow came from behind and held her arms back. Yoruichi's heart rate quickened, her mind went blank. As the Hallow materialized its hand into a blade, she closed her eyes, and only a certain someone came to mind. Ichigo pain reeked through her body as she felt herself falling from the Hallow's hold. Seeing this as her chance, she placed a hand over the hole in her stomach and flash stepped her way towards Ichigo's home. Ichigo read over the note from his father, kicking off his shoes. He crumbled it and tossed it in the trash, walking up the stairs to his room. His hair and clothes were wet from the rain, so he changed into jeans and a T-Mobile t-shirt. Collapsing on his bed, he stared out his window at the sky again. November 1st, what a way to bring in the new month. Sighing, he closed his eyes, Yoruichi's entire form coming to his thoughts. I wonder what she's doing. He thought out loud. Suddenly, his heart dropped. Ichigo. A voice called. Yoruichi. He said, sitting up. What was that? Several knocks interrupted his thoughts. He ran down the steps and opened the door, his breath catching. The rain continued to pour, its calming sound tattering on the roof and ground. Ichigo's eyes were wide, his heart racing. Before him stood a limp, bleeding Yoruichi. Yoruichi, what's wrong? What happened? His eyes traveled to her stomach, where her hand clutched her open wound. Blood flowed freely, dyeing her pants and the ground beneath her red. In haste, he picked her up and ran to his room, laying her gently on his bed. She was shivering, soaking wet. Her darkened skin, he could tell, was pale. The color gone from her and her golden eyes were drained of their spark. He looked at her frantically, removing her hand from her wound. Jesus, Yoruichi. He left her side for a moment, returning with bandages and antibiotics. Forgetting about quality, he ripped open her shirt, cleansing her wound. Ichigo, she whispered, hissing in pain when he applied the medicine to her stomach. He gave her an apologetic look and continued. She watched him, her ears only registering the sound of his breathing and the drops of rain that hit the roof. She felt him rip off the remainder of her shirt, then she felt him lift her up, wrapping his arms around her as he began to bandage her. If only the circumstances were different, she might have enjoyed being topless and laying on his bed. He gently, slowly, laid her back down. Get some rest, I'm gonna run to the store and pick up a few more rolls of bandages. Ichigo's voice reached her ears and she nodded, smiling gently. We'll talk after you've regained some strength. Water dripped from her hair and rolled down her face as she nodded slightly, her eyes closing. Ichigo waited for a moment, watching as her, debating on whether or not he should leave her in her condition. His eyes drifted over her bare weight. His face reddened as he looked away, closing his eyes. Stupid. He whispered to himself, walking over to his closet and setting a shirt on the desk beside her. He sighed, pulling the covers up over her shivering body. I'll be back. He whispered, turning and exiting the house. The rain had only let up a bit as Ichigo stepped outside. He grabbed his umbrella from the corner of his porch and opened it, walking casually down the street. He glanced up to his bedroom window. Concern and worry written all over his face. Would she be alright till he got back? I really shouldn't leave her unprotected right now, but she needs gauze and bandages. Sighing to himself, he continued to walk on. Up in his room, Yoruichi groaned in pain, beads of sweat rolling down her face. She shivered, feeling her body become cold. Her eyes opened slowly, glancing around. Ichigo, please hurry. She glanced out the window, spotting several hollows hovering in the air, staring directly at her. She suddenly felt a surge of fear, watching as they moved closer to the window. Ichigo. Her heart yelled. Ichigo stopped mid-step, looking back in the direction of his house. He extended his spiritual connection, sensing the presence of hollows. His face became blank. Yoruichi whispered, running as fast as he could back to his house. Yoruichi sat up slightly, trying to get up. She failed and fell to the floor, backing up as a hollow appeared in front of her. Her eyes narrowed, 2 more hollows appearing. Damn it, she thought, looking around for anything she could use as a weapon. The hollows began laughing, reaching for her. Her eyes closed, her heart ringing in her dot. What the hell are you laughing at for your bastards? Ichigo yelled as he drove his Zangetsu through the first hollow's mask. The hollow dispersed with a shrill scream. Yoruichi looked up at the teen, amazed. She didn't even sense him coming in. Ichigo never faltered his deathly glare upon the other 2 demons, his sword pointed straight. The hollows tried shimmering out, but Ichigo's spirit energy stopped them in their tracks. And just where do you think you're going? Ichigo smirked, in flash, both hollows dispersed with screeches. Yoruichi watched as Ichigo put away his blade, kneeling down beside her. Are you alright? He asked, his eyes and voice full of concern. She nodded weakly and tried to stand, the wound on her stomach causing her to gasp in pain. With a lazy smile, Ichigo lifted her into his arms, laying her back down on the bed. I wasn't able to make it to the store and I don't want to leave you alone like this, so we'll just have to make do with what we have. Ichigo sighed, pulling up a chair beside her. I'll check in the morning to see if there are any bandages downstairs. He opened his drawer and grabbed a small notebook. He began writing in it, leaving Yoruichi with one eyebrow raised. Ichigo, what are you doing? Yoruichi asked as she leaned up a bit, watching him. Ichigo looked over at her, his eyes softening slightly. He glanced out of the window, smiling as the rays of sun made the rain shimmer. Her eyes followed his, and she remained silent as he did his thing. Alright. He said after a few hours, setting the pen down on the desk beside him, placing the notebook back and looked down to a sleeping Yoruichi, smiling as he pulled up the sheets on his bed. He yawned, his attention once again drawn to the rain. Is it gonna rain all month? He whispered aloud, opening his closet door and climbing in, leaving it open so he could see her. If any hollow tries to attack her while I'm here, they're dead. He mumbled again before drifting off. Yoruichi sat up abruptly, sweat rolling down her face as she breathed heavily. Pain shot through her body, and she glanced down to notice she had tore open her wound again. Damn it. Throwing her legs over the side of the bed, she stood limply and slowly walked towards the bathroom. Ichigo heard the door close, he sat up looking over to the bed. He walked towards the door and knocked. Yoruichi? Are you alright? He asked, no reply. Yoruichi? He opened the door slowly, seeing her sitting in the tub, her knees pulled up to her, bloody flowing from her wound. Yoruichi. He quickly kneeled beside her, touching her arm gently. She lifted her head and looked at him, pain written all over her face. Come on, let's get you cleaned up. He yawned, turning on the shower. He grabbed a rag and foamed it up with soap, bringing to her skin and slowly caressing her. She stared up at him, amazed. He's giving me a bath. Ichigo laughed at her expression and grabbed her hair, putting it over her shoulder as he washed her back. After attending to her arms, legs and anything else not associated with her privacy, he rinsed her off, grabbing a towel and helping her up. He held open the towel for her, smiling when she walked into it. Wrapping the towel around her, he helped her back to his bed, then turning and leaving the room for a few moments. Why is he doing all this? She thought to herself, looking out of the window. The sun had just graced the world with its light as it slowly ascended into the sky. The rain had stopped, for now at least. I wonder why he's going through all this trouble for me. I've never known anyone to do this much for someone. Alright, one's shorter than the other, so you pick which one. Ichigo said, holding up 2 red nightgowns. Yoruichi glanced at him, then to the garments he held in his hands. Well. I'll take the short one. She murmured, reaching out for the slip. Ichigo handed it to her, then turned his back, waiting for her to change. What are you doing? She asked, unwrapping the towel, biting back a whimper. Ichigo half turned, blushing as he tried his best to look directly at her face. Yoruichi chuckled. It would have been more amusing and fun if only she weren't so damn hurt. You can take a peek if you want, Ichigo, I don't mind. She said huskily. What was it that made her get so aroused around him? Ichigo's eyes slowly darted down, then up, his face redder. Let's just get you bandaged. He said, turning and running down his stairs. Yoruichi smiled softly, sitting down. He was really shy, and though she didn't quite understand why. He was such a handsome teen. And she knew he could really satisfy her if he'd only give in to "Does he desire me?" she thought, looking up at the ceiling. Maybe it's my desire for him. Alright Yoruichi, I found some other bandages downstairs. Tomorrow, if you can, we can both head out to get more. Huh? Her eyes fell on him as he looked up and immediately blushed. You've already seen me before Ichigo, you should be used to it by now. She grinned, leaning back. He swallowed hard and shook his head, ignoring the impulse to ravish her. Let's just get you bandaged. He said, sitting beside her and wrapping the cloth around her torso. She had to admit, feeling him this close and the occasional feather-light touches were enough to make her lose control. She closed her eyes as his skin brushed against hers briefly, a soft glow coming from her. Yoruichi felt a slight pull in the pit of her stomach, her hands clenching the bed sheets in front of her. All too soon Ichigo was done, and his close proximity lingered for a few moments. It's about 6:45, so I'm heading back to bed. He yawned, taking a step away from her. A small slender hand grabbed his wrist, causing him to turn. Yoruichi smiled sadly up at him, her eyes practically begging him to stay with her. What's wrong? He asked, his eyes full of concern. I just don't want to sleep alone. She mumbled, blushing in embarrassment. Ichigo smiled tiredly and sat down beside her. Then scoot over. Ichigo yawned, waiting for her to move it so he could lay down. She did so slowly, watching as he pulled up the sheets and covered them up. Get some sleep, Yoruichi. He murmured, facing her. She smiled and looked down into his eyes, then laid down beside him. Why am I so giddy around him? She questioned herself, her eyes traveling over his face. I'm always the one in control. Ichigo opened his eyes, grunting slightly. What is it? Why do you keep staring at me? He asked, staring back into her golden orbs. Nothing, could you just put your arm around me or something? Yoruichi's eyes gave away a hint of fear, causing Ichigo to scoot closer, his arm hesitantly lifting and draping over Dot. Why are you so scared all of a sudden? He began, bringing himself closer still. Look, Yoruichi, ever since old society, you haven't been the same around me. What's going on? What's got you so afraid? And this was it, the moment of truth. Yoruichi looked up to him, her eyes revealing things she didn't want to show. She slowly brought herself closer to him, her head resting on his, her eyes closing as her arms wrapped around his Dot. Yoruichi? He asked, blushing as she nuzzled him. Her eyes opened slowly as she pulled back to look him in the eyes. Have you been having this nightmare? Ichigo narrowed his eyes, looking down into Yoruichi's eyes as she spoke softly. He could sense the fear she felt, the uncertainty. A nightmare? What about? He asked, frowning as she looked away from him. She d him, bringing her head back against his Dot. Is this really Yoruichi? Ichigo thought, she's acting strange. Yoruichi. We were training, you and me. We were both without each other, so no one could see us. Everything was going fine, I was teasing you, and then this black cloud appeared out of nowhere. Being the curious cat that I am, I walked towards it and then, all I remember is seeing you strike down a hollow, only its talon had gone through your Dot. You died right there, in my arms. Ichigo felt his heart clench as she broke into sobs. She was definitely beside herself, of that he was sure. She never cried in front of him. She was strong, tough, and at ease. Not an emotional wreck. Feeling the need to comfort her, Ichigo pulled her to him more. Come on Yoruichi, it's me here. He murmured. She nuzzled him again, trying to get as close to him as she possibly could. I'll be damned if I ever let a hollow kill me. His voice was firm, reassuringly so. With a slight smile, Yoruichi could imagine the hot-headed Ichigo taking on every hollow. He sensed her mood change as she sighed with a dry laugh. You know, I've got to say, you really know how to comfort a girl, don't you? Her devious smirk told Ichigo she was feeling slightly better. I'm glad I came back to this realm. Yeah, me too. Ichigo barely whispered, unaware that she'd heard. So, if you're fine now, I'm gonna sleep elsewhere. Ichigo said, preparing to get up. As soon as he sat up and put his feet on the cold hardwood floor. Yoruichi's long, slender arms rose to wrap around his neck from behind, causing Ichigo to blush furiously. She smirked more, leaning up and pressing her against his back, her coming close to his ear. Where are you going, Ichigo? She whispered flirtatiously. Yep, she was back to her normal self, just like that. Despite the pain in her stomach, Yoruichi leaned against him more, loving the way he felt towards her. Don't you want to sleep here, with me? Ah, there it was. Yoruichi, I think you should get some sleep. Ichigo said, glancing back. She pouted her out. What if I have that nightmare again? Sighing, Ichigo pulled his feet and legs back up on the bed, turning to her slightly, her arms around his neck from the side. She grinned. Fine. But don't try anything. I'm not sleeping with you that way. "By Ichigo, what kind of girl do you take me for?" she asked innocently. "The kind that would take advantage of a virgin," he mumbled, turning on his side away from her. She leaned over him once again, her brushing against his earlobe as she whispered. "Well, we can change that." Her sultry voice made him blush. "You know you want Ichigo, there's nothing wrong with how you feel." Her voice was tempting, inviting him to her. "Would you just go to sleep?" Ichigo said loudly, blushing even more than before. With Yoruichi laid back, cuddling close to his back, purring. "Are you purring?" Ichigo asked, turning slightly. She lifted herself up, resting her head in her hand as she propped her arm up on her elbow. Her eyes looked into his, that devious sly smirk still gracing her dot. Though she seemed fine, Ichigo could see the fear hiding in her eyes. With a sigh, he wrapped his arm around her, causing her to purr more as she closed her eyes. The sun shone brightly through the window, bathing the sleeping forms of Yoruichi and Ichigo in a golden light. Opening her golden eyes, Yoruichi squinted, raising her arm to block out the sun. Groaning, she tugged gently on the blind string hanging on the wall, causing the window blinds to fall. Smiling, she stretched, only to stop with her arms above her head as she glanced down at Ichigo's bare arm sprawled out over her stomach. Blushing slightly, she felt a shiver go up her spine as she felt the hot breath of Ichigo on her neck. Turning her head slightly, she saw Ichigo's face right next to hers, his peaceful expression causing her to smile. "I guess he does have a softer side after all," Yoruichi thought, bringing her hand up to his face. She trailed her over his jaw, marveling at how handsome he was, considering his age. His eyes opened slowly, and for a few moments, they just laid there, gazing into one another's eyes. Finally, reality hit Ichigo and he jumped, falling back off the bed. Yoruichi laughed, leaning over the bed to look at him. "Good morning to you too, Ichigo," she said, chuckling slightly. Ichigo groaned and stood turning away from her. "Whatever," he said, walking to his drawer and retrieving some clothes. He walked into the bathroom, closing the door halfway. "How's your wound?" he yelled slightly, just loud enough so she could hear. Yoruichi stood, stretching. "It feels better, thanks to your aid," she said, smirking as she walked towards the bathroom. She strode in, and Ichigo was caught with his pants down. "Yoruichi!" he shouted, blushing as he grabbed the shower curtain and pulled it around himself. Yoruichi blushed herself and turned, laughing slightly. "Whoops." "Whoops," Ichigo said. "Yoruichi, I hardly think it's whoops." "Oh, shut up, Ichigo. Be comfortable with your body. You've got a nice one, so why not flaunt it?" she said, folding her arms over her as she turned back to him, her eyes closed for his privacy. "Besides, it's not like I haven't seen you before, or any other man for that matter. Seen one, you seen 'em all, you know," she teased, opening one eye. He threw his towel at her and stepped out of the shower, grabbing another and wrapping it around himself. He mumbled to himself incomparable things, walking past her. "Shower's yours," he said, closing the door. Yoruichi laughed, shaking her head as she proceeded in stripping herself, turning on the hot water to the shower. Ichigo has found himself on the edge a lot lately since Yoruichi showed up in need of his care a few days ago. He knew taking care of her would have its naughty perks and puns. She was the most lecherous of women, and Ichigo knew he'd set himself up for her plays once he stripped her of her clothes. Even the thought or notion of stripping her caused him to shiver, bringing his mind to the gutter once more. Seeing her body once too many had already scarred his mind in both the best and worst of ways. Even now as he stepped into his room, Yoruichi was laying back in nothing but one of his white muscle shirts and black boxers. Feeling the blood instantly rush to his face, he turned, scowling slightly as he folded his arms. "Yoruichi," he murmured, tapping his foot irritably. Yoruichi's eyes opened, her set in her signature smirk that made every living thing shudder. He turned his head to look over his shoulder, giving her angry eyes. She sat up innocently, making it a point to stretch her long legs out, bending one up. She brought her right arm to rest on her right knee as she leaned back on the hand extended behind her. Her eyes looked amused at him. His face instantly turned a darker shade of red, but he found himself not looking away. After all, he'd have to get used to this until her stomach had completely healed. "What is it, Ichigo?" she purred teasingly. Her seductiveness was very enticing. Although, Ichigo couldn't complain, there are worse bodies he could be looking at right now. Instead, he was blessed with the goddess of flash herself. Her beauty defined the term goddess. And she had no eyesore. Far from it. "Don't you have any other clothes? At hat and clogs or something?" Ichigo asked in annoyance. Of course he liked being treated to such views, but it did a number on his senses, and being that he was a boy of the age. "Why? I'm comfortable with this," she stated, looking down at herself. Her eyes returned to his, that same spark of interest burned bright in her golden eyes. For a moment, Ichigo just stared into them, feeling as if he were falling through a never-ending void. Those golden eyes, alluring and haunting. Those eyes that had plagued him, haunted his every dream. And the owner of those eyes. The woman who had such a tough exterior but was just as vulnerable as every other woman out there. Yoruichi felt the same pull. She knew she was attracted to him. Hell, she'd had an interest in him since she first laid her eyes on him. The orange-haired boy whose spirit energy rivaled that of the great captains of Soul Society. He went so far as to even surpass them. She'd never seen a teenager with talent such as he had, nor one who were as handsome and as passionate as Ichigo. The day he left the Soul Society was the day she declared her infatuation with him. Before then, she refused to allow herself to even think she was attached to such a naive teen. But now, things are different. Now, she'd openly, just as much gladly, admit her undeniable fantasy of secretly wanting him. You may be comfortable, but think about how I feel about Yoruichi. Ichigo said, dropping his arms to his sides and turning to her. It's not fair that you torture me and all I can do is shy away. He laughed, easing the moment with humor. Her eyes pierced through him, clad with mystery. Finally, she threw her legs over the side of the bed and stood, wincing slightly at the momentary pain in her stomach. You don't have to shy away, Ichigo. Stepping to him, she placed a single hand on his bare, appreciating the invitation she got when he wore only his pants. His skin was practically screaming to be touched, just as hers was. However, Ichigo wasn't the type of guy to feel up on any girl. I don't make you turn your head whenever I change. You're welcome to look anytime. Cop a feel if you want. You're at that curious age. You should build your experience in things now in order to be good at them later. She said huskily, sliding her hand down over his abs. Ichigo inhaled, a subtle smirk flashing across his dot. He glanced down at her, shaking his head as he grabbed her wandering hand. We should check your wound. He said, causing her to groan and sigh. Fine, mood killer. She mumbled, plopping down on the bed. Ichigo shook his head and disappeared into the bathroom, coming out with a few medical supplies. Mood killer? There was no mood. He said, wanting to carry any conversation. You came onto me like always. It shouldn't be any surprise that it ended the same as last time. Yoruichi grunted and laid back, folding up the muscle shirt to just below her. Comfortable, she laid her arms beneath her head, looking out the window as he settled in a chair beside her. You shouldn't push me away all the time. It might do you good to let go. Turning her attention back to him, she watched as he removed the bloody gauze and bandage from her torso. Let go? Letting go with you might kill me. He tossed the clothes aside and dampened a much cleaner gauze with alcohol. Head and clogs would hate it if I took advantage of you. Advantage? Yoruichi winced as he slowly set the medicated gauze on her wound. He finished his cleansing and tossed that gauze aside with the other clothes. How would you be taking advantage of me? I'm practically inviting you to me. An invitation I can't accept. He murmured, setting a gauze on her stomach and proceeding to wrap a fresh bandage around her torso. Why not? Yoruichi inquired, raising a purple brow. Sighing, Ichigo finished his wrapping and pulled her shirt down. Ichigo, if I'm welcoming you, why not indulge and have some fun? I'm just a kid, what do you expect? Ichigo shrugged, gathering the dirty used rags and throwing them in his trash. After washing his hands, he settled back in the chair beside her, his ears registering the thunder in the distance. The rain had already begun to fall once again, but surprisingly, it didn't dampen the mood. I wonder if it's going to rain all month. Ichigo, am I not attractive to you? Ichigo's attention quickly jotted down to her. Her eyes were cast outside, an unreadable expression on her face. No, you are. He corrected, his eyes dancing down her body. You're very attractive. The words rolled off as he brought his eyes back to hers. Her eyes turned from the window to him. But, it's just, I'm not ready yet. I know it sounds strange coming from someone like me, but I'd like to wait until I feel it's right. It's got nothing to do with how you look. Am I really beautiful? Yoruichi asked, staring at him. Ichigo chuckled, opening the drawer of his dresser and grabbing a shirt, slipping it over his head. Ichigo. Casually, Ichigo gave her a smirk and strode from the room. Ichigo? Yoruichi asked again, getting up and following him down the stairs. She followed him to the kitchen, catching a carton of milk as he tossed it her way. Very. He smiled, grabbing a box of Pocky. Yoruichi smirked, blushing slightly. She nodded, holding up the carton of milk and nodding it his way. She took a long gulp. Oh, Ichigo. Yuzu yelled as she stepped into the house. Karen and Issen right behind her. They turned to the kitchen and froze. We're back. Yoruichi swallowed the milk, then set the carton on the counter, standing a couple feet in front of Ichigo. Karen's eyebrow twitched as she glanced the goddess up and down, noting the fact that she was wearing Ichigo's underclothes. She took in the fact that Ichigo's pants were unbuckled, his shirt wrinkled slightly. Son. How wonderful. Issen yelled, blushing as he ran towards the dark-skinned female. Very good, Ichigo. He smiled, giving him a nod of approval. She's quite the looker, my son. Yoruichi glanced at Ichigo, almost laughing. Perhaps she should have a little fun. She's not my girlfriend and we didn't do anything. Ichigo yelled, punching his father. Isin launched out, grabbing his son in a headlock. Come on Ichigo, don't be shy now. She's pretty. Get off. Ichigo shouted, tossing his father across the room. Would you let me explain? This is Yoruichi Shiun. Ichigo said, standing beside her. With a smirk, Yoruichi slid her arms up around Ichigo's neck, pressing against him. Hello. She said, nuzzling Ichigo's neck. I'm sorry we didn't tell you sooner, but I've been seeing your son for some time now. Ichigo felt his heart stop. His face went pale as his sister Karen folded her arms over her, giving him a look that asked for an explanation. Isin and Yuzu both clasped their hands together, smiling. Come on Ichigo, tell them. Yoruichi purred, straining to get closer to him. She knew he was enjoying their proximity, she could feel it radiating off him, and she also knew he could tell she enjoyed it as well. Ichigo, if you're not claiming her then let me. Isin grinned, stepping forward. Protectively, Ichigo wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tighter to him. Yoruichi's mine. He shouted, the words leaving him before he could think. Grinning like the cat she was, Yoruichi settled her head on his shoulder, relishing in their closeness. We'll be upstairs. Don't disturb us. Ichigo said, walking with his arm around her. Are you protecting my son? Isin proudly asked, stepping in front of them. Ichigo brought his fist up and slugged his dad. Would you stop treating me like a kid? He shouted again, running now with Yoruichi up to his room. He locked the door behind him, turning to her. Aren't you the one who said you're still just a kid though, Ichigo? That's not what I meant. I meant that in a kid's manner, I'm not ready to jump into bed with anyone. I know it sounds corny, but I want my first time to be with someone who I'm in love with. Yoruichi couldn't help but feel a small pang in her heart. A hint of want and jealousy. She suddenly wanted to be that girl he fell in love with. Glancing outside to the rain, she smirked. She had a month to make him fall in love with her and to in turn, fall in love with him. Who said rain couldn't be fun? Ichigo yelled, falling back on his rear. His eyes were wide, face red as sweat beads began to form. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Time seemed to stop as Yoruichi looked at him from her position, one leg out of the shower, her other leg cocked up on the ledge of the bathtub. Neither said a word as a dark blush lit up her own face. Seeing that he was staring, frozen, she smirked, stepping out and walking towards him dripping wet. Ichigo felt his heart. Why did she have to constantly tease him? Ichigo, you're staring you know. Do you like what you see? Would you like a closer look? She asked, squatting beside him. With wide eyes, Ichigo looked down. Ahhh. He screamed, squirming back and hitting the small bathroom table. Several bottles of hygiene products, shampoo and soap fell around him, some hitting him on the head. Yoruichi chuckled in amusement, standing and folding her arms under her. Ichigo was too mortified to notice the deep gash in her stomach had healed and disappeared without leaving a horrible scar. You know, with you being the way you are, never wanting to steal a peek at me when I'm offering you the opportunity to see me fully, it makes me wonder if you don't swing the right way. Her tone was mocking, and Ichigo felt great annoyance. Jumping up, completely forgetting her ness, Ichigo stepped up to her, looking down at her. He scowled. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Yoruichi just chuckled, removing her arms and putting them on her, leaning up, her face directly in front of his. Wouldn't you like to know? She grinned, purring slightly. This made Ichigo even more frustrated. Bringing up his fist, his eyes got big, fueled with anger. I am not gay. He shouted. Yoruichi couldn't help but laugh as she raised a slender brow. I'm skeptical about that. You're a boy, you shouldn't turn your head when I get undressed. You should be treating your eyes to an enticing view. I know my body can't be that bad. For a moment Ichigo was silent, his anger subsiding as he blushed again. No, not bad at all. He murmured, allowing her those few seconds of boasting pride. But it's not right to look. I'm not some pervert you know. I have feelings like that, but I won't go around like some peeping Tom. He said, shoving his hands in his pockets and turning around. Besides, you're wise as hell and I have admired your curves a few times. Yoruichi felt her heart quicken. She hadn't expected him to say that last part. She watched as he walked from the bathroom, fast strides. Sighing with a smile, she slowly put on one of Ichigo's t-shirts and a pair of his blue jeans, along with his studded belt. Outside, Ichigo laid back on his bed, staring out at the very sunny and very clear sky. The rain had subsided for now, but he knew it would return later that night. The bathroom door opened and Yoruichi stepped out. Ichigo sat up, stretching. Well, it's nice out today. Why don't we go get some air? Ichigo offered, putting on his shoes. Yoruichi glanced out of the window, then nodded. Yeah, I could use some air. She said, smiling. Ichigo nodded, standing and grabbing his wallet. You know, my wound has healed. Yoruichi began as they walked down the stairs. Ichigo opened his mouth to reply, but then growled and turned, sticking his foot out, face met foot. What's the deal dad? Ichigo growled, bringing his fist up. Isin smiled, grabbing Yoruichi's hand. "I'm so envious of you, Ichigo, my son." He cried, tears streaming down his face. Ichigo's eyebrow twitched as he glanced from his moping father to his sister Yuzu, who was giggling from the living room doorway. Karen narrowed her eyes, coming down the stairs. "Move." She yelled, kicking her dad in the rear, sending him flying down the stairs and into a wall. Isin quickly recovered. "That's my little girl." He smiled happily, the tears long gone as he ran to hug his daughter who punched and kicked at him until their small brawl turned into a huge frenzied one, Karen obviously having the upper hand as she planted her fist once again in her dad's face. "Ugh. You're such an immature dad." Karen yelled, running out the door. Yoruichi laughed openly, staring down at the sighing Isin. "Ah, honey, our kids are growing up so fast." He smiled, his eyes shimmering. Ichigo shook his head, grabbing Yoruichi's hand as he walked past Isin. "We're going out, we'll be back later." Isin went to launch at Ichigo, however, the door was slammed in his face, causing him to crash into it, sliding down it with swirling eyes. "I'm glad it stopped raining. Being stuck in the house all the time is kind of depressing." Yoruichi nodded, looking down at the park to watch the kids play. They came to a stop as they leaned on the rail of the bridge he'd normally cross when going to school. "You said we'd both be back later, does that mean I can stay with you?" Yoruichi asked. A light breeze blew by, rustling the autumn leaves around their feet. Unconsciously, Ichigo scooted closer to her, their arms and shoulders touching as they leaned on their forearms over the railing. Her hair blew slightly, causing her to shiver. Smiling, Ichigo wrapped an arm around her in an effort to keep her warm. "Well, I don't see any harm keeping you at my place." His face reddened. "Other than killing me with your assets." Yoruichi laughed, smirking. "You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like. I know you don't want to return to the hat and clogs shop. That perverted man probably doesn't leave you alone." "Why do you think I take on the form of a cat?" Yoruichi said matter-of-factly. Ichigo let out a chuckle, pulling her closer to him. "Good modification." He smiled, looking down at her. Her eyes rose to meet his. Another breeze blew by, yet they said nothing. Their eyes were locked, unwilling to falter. Yoruichi felt a familiar pull inside her, growing stronger and stronger. Ichigo, likewise, felt as if he were being dragged under some sort of spell. Slowly, their faces inched closer. "Ichigo!" Keigo yelled, waving as he rode his bike towards the unofficial couple. Keigo's eyes widened as soon as he saw the dark-skinned goddess. Whoa, he blushed, eyes wide. Ichigo stepped in front of her. "Eyes off, Keigo." Ichigo glared. Keigo smirked, nudging Ichigo's arm. "You lucky dog." He said with evil, perverted eyes. His eyes scanned Yoruichi's clothed body, her curves visible even through Ichigo's slightly baggy clothes. "It's not even like that, you perv." "Oh really? Then why was your arm around her and why were you two about to?" Keigo asked, raising his eyebrow, grinning still. Ichigo felt the irritation rise. "There's certainly no reason for you to be ashamed." "I ain't ashamed. I told you, it isn't like that." "Then why are you blushing?" "Ugh, come here you little hentai." Ichigo yelled, grabbing Keigo in a headlock. Yoruichi laughed as the two boys fought, smirking as Ichigo came out the victor. Keigo had a small tear at the corner of his eye. "You don't have to be so protective of your secret relationship. I won't tell anyone. Just tell me you're with her and I'll drop it." Not wanting to carry on the fight or argument, Ichigo sighed. Alright. She's my girlfriend." He said falsely. Keigo grinned, grabbing his bike and pedaling off. "The guys are gonna love to hear and see this." Keigo called back, flipping open his cell and showing Ichigo the picture of him and Yoruichi just moments ago. "Why that little?" Ichigo growled. Yoruichi laughed and grabbed his arm. "Just leave it alone, Ichigo. It can't be that bad to be seen with me." Ichigo stared at her, smiling as he shook his head. "No, it's definitely not," but Ichigo cocked his head, glaring towards the tiny dot down the road that was Keigo. "You don't know my friends. They're all perverted in a way and they'll be on you like vultures. You think too much about things like Ichigo." Yoruichi began walking towards the small park just off the river bank. "You should cut loose once in a while." She called back to him, throwing him a grin as she ran towards one of the swings. Ichigo watched her from his spot on the bridge, smiling. She waved him over and he began his jog towards her. He stood behind her, pushing her as she began to swing back and forth. "If I don't worry about things, who will? You've seen my dad. He's obviously not anyone to look up to." Yoruichi swung her legs, looking down at her shoes. "I always thought of myself as the arrogant father of Yuzu and Karen. And even of my dad. He's so caught up in my mother's death that he'd forgotten how to be a parent himself." "You still don't have to be so uptight all the time. Your mother's death wasn't your fault." Ichigo stopped pushing her, his hands gripping the chains of the swing just above hers. Yoruichi tilted her head back, looking up at him. "I was the one who had to go try and save that apparition. If I hadn't been playing the hero, my mom would still be here." Yoruichi moved her hands up over his. You were doing the right thing. You were trying to save a little girl's life. How could you have known it was a Hallow? Ichigo shrugged. Smiling gently, Yoruichi drew his hands before letting go and swinging. Ichigo stared at her back for a moment, then smiled. I guess you're right, Yoruichi. I guess you're right. He laughed dryly, sitting on the swing beside her, swinging himself. Ichigo noticed she kept going higher as he did, and so, the swinging contest began. Yoruichi pumped her legs faster, looking over at him as he got higher as she did. Chuckling, she jumped off the swing and began running out towards the forest. Hey! Ichigo yelled after her as he jumped from the swing and took off running after her. Yoruichi! He called, stepping into the wooded area. He could hear her laughter, and his senses told him to look up. Gah! Ichigo yelped as Yoruichi came toppling down on him. What are you doing? Having fun. Play with me. Yoruichi smirked, smacking his as she took off running through the woods. You're it. She yelled back at him, laughing all the while. Ichigo felt a glimmer of interest as he took off after her once again. A few minutes later, Ichigo caught up with her as she was running down a grassy hill. Grabbing her around the waist, both went tumbling to the ground, rolling down the hill. At the bottom, Ichigo landed on top of her, both laughing loudly. See? It's fun to cut loose. Yoruichi grinned, looking up at him. Her eyes sparkled with that same mischievous glint. Yeah. Ichigo laughed, looking down at her. His laughter subsided as he stared into her eyes. Those golden eyes of hers were mesmerizing. That he knew. They held everything in them, an endless void of emotion that led to the very depths of her soul. Yoruichi stared into his just the same, reading his feelings like a child's book. Slowly, he leaned down, their inches apart. Well. What do we have here? Startled, both Yoruichi and Ichigo looked up at the figure in green. His blonde hair veiled with a striped hat. Kisuke. Yoruichi sighed, laying her head back. Leave it to you to ruin the moment. Oh, I'm sorry. Was I interrupting something? Kisuke asked with a smirk. His old friend rolled her eyes, sitting up as Ichigo stood. So, hat and clogs, what do you want this time? Ichigo scowled, folding his arms over his, looking away embarrassed. I was just through. Right, you're never just passing through, Kisuke. Yoruichi glared, standing, patting the dirt off her clothes. Ah, you need clothes. Kisuke smirked, tapping his on the ground. Let's go back to the shop so we can fetch you a nice fitting wardrobe. Without objections, Ichigo and Yoruichi followed, disappointingly, Kisuke to the shop. The two couldn't help but steal side glances at one another, not noticing the devilish smirk on Kisuke's face. Don't give her that. Ichigo yelled at the perverted Urahara as he held up a very revealing body slip. Why not? Kisuke frowned, looking towards the bathroom where Yoruichi was changing into her normal attire, red shirt, tight black pants, boots, and of course, her black arm ties. Although her last shirt had been orange and the ties were white, Kisuke decided it was time to change a few things, since, obviously, a few things had changed. Turning back to Ichigo, he finally opened his ears to hear Ichigo's last few words. Because she'll wear only that. The orange-haired boy blushed furiously as he took the slip from Urahara's hands and looked around nervously, his heart racing. Quickly, Ichigo. Get rid of it before she comes out and sees. Ichigo said to himself mentally. Spotting a window, Ichigo hurriedly ran to it, opening it and throwing it outside. Sighing, Ichigo sat back down on the floor. Maybe she liked this one. Kisuke said again, pulling out a red dress with a long thigh-high slit up the left leg. The dress was strapless, the back open. Ichigo growled, ready to snatch up by the throat. So far that night, he'd given her nothing but my outfits. Hell, some of the items could barely even be called clothes. You're asking for it. Ichigo said through gritted teeth. Come now, Ichigo. I'm doing this for you. Just think about it, Kisuke began, wrapping his arm around Ichigo's neck. Ichigo froze, raising his eyebrows, looking at Kisuke's arm. Yoruichi in nothing but a tight halter top and a short leather skirt. The picture that came to Ichigo's mind brought a bright red blush upon his face. He could picture Yoruichi straddling his lap, her skirt bunched up. Get off me, you freaking perverted old man. Ichigo shouted, pushing Urahara back as he stood, fist raised. Are you tranquil or something, you homo? Laughing loudly, Yoruichi stepped out in her red and black outfit, shaking her head. Can you two behave for 10 damn minutes? Yoruichi raised her purple brow, cocking her head to the side. She let her hair hang, and Ichigo had to admit, she did look stunning when her curves were visible. Folding his arms over his and turning, Ichigo growled, giving Kisuke an evil glare. Kisuke, what did you do to him now? Nothing, I was asking him to help pick some clothes out for you. Innocently, Kisuke handed her a bag of things. Yoruichi pursed her up, narrowing her eyes as she studied her longtime friend. Aha. Something tells me you two were being bad boys. Yoruichi said, more to Ichigo than anyone else. Don't start. Ichigo warned, shaking his head as he turned to her. Start what? Yoruichi smiled, walking towards him. I wasn't gonna do anything, Ichigo. She said, brushing past his arm and down the long hall of Urahara's shop. You should consider yourself lucky. Yoruichi has taken a serious interest in you, Ichigo. That doesn't happen often. Kisuke smirked, rubbing his sideburns. Ichigo Mfed then headed off in Yoruichi's direction, leaving behind a smirking Urahara. In the kitchen, Yoruichi had opened herself a carton of milk, offering Ichigo some as he walked in. He eagerly took the offer and gulped a large portion of the milk down. Thirsty much? Yoruichi smirked, leaning against the counter as she took another swag of the tasteful beverage. She sighed as she finished it off, tossing the empty box in the garbage. It started to rain again. Yoruichi sighed, looking up at Ichigo. Yeah, pretty soon it'll be snowing. He said, glancing out of the window. Kisuke came through the doorway whistling, spinning his in his hand. What's with you? Me? Urahara asked, stopping and tilting his head. Nothing, the real question is, what's with the two of you? Yoruichi blushed slightly, looking down as she bit her lip. Ichigo raised a brow, narrowing his eyes. I don't know what's going through your gutter of a mind, but we're just friends. Just like the two of you. Oh, just like us, so you two have. Ichigo's face reddened more, his eyes nearly popping out of his head. Guess not then. Kisuke, stop teasing him. Only I can do that. Yoruichi hissed, glaring. Kisuke turned to her, amused. Oh, so has yours now. Yoruichi gave Urahara an evil STFU look and darted out of the room, blushing herself. So, Ichigo, how about I teach you a few things, eh? Ichigo could only roll his eyes as the perverted reaper began his ranting, forcing Ichigo to follow him to the back rooms. Yoruichi laid back on the porch, watching the rain. She could only imagine what the two reapers were doing inside. With Kisuke, anything was possible. Moments later, Ichigo stepped out, smiling at her. Hey, are you ready? He asked, lending her a hand to help her up. Yoruichi eyed him, scoping him. What are you looking for? What happened there? She asked, turning to see a smirking Kisuke winking at her. Stepping out into the rain, Ichigo released some of his spirit energy, forming an umbrella-like shelter for her. I talk. Ichigo responded, shrugging slightly. How about a race called Yoruichi? Nodding, Yoruichi began to flash, stepping ahead of him. For a moment, a brief smirk crossed his as he looked back to a smirking Urahara who nodded and gave him the thumbs up. Ichigo inhaled before flash stepping after her. Yoruichi could sense Ichigo gaining on her, so she decided to go faster, flashing stepping into his room. In her mind, she'd formed the perfect teasing plan. Ichigo stepped into the darkened room, looking around for her. She smirked, wrapping her arms around his neck from behind and leaning up to whisper into his ear. I win. She smirked, pressing herself against him. Ichigo took a deep breath, then turned, pinning her to the wall. I suppose you get a prize then. Ah, the tables have turned. Yoruichi looked up at Ichigo with wide eyes. Her face flushed. Ichigo held her arms above her head as he dipped his face lower. Her breath hitched, a small coming from her. Head and clogs were right. You do become submissive and weak. He chuckled, backing away from her and going into the bathroom. Yoruichi remained frozen, her heart singing. Damn that Kisuke. She said softly, lifting her hand to her heart. He told Ichigo how to tease her back. That certainly wasn't fair. Alright, if we're gonna play this game. Ichigo came out expecting to see a shocked Yoruichi, instead, his eyes bulged out of his head. What's the matter, Ichigo? Yoruichi purred as she laid back on his bed wearing only that same see-through body slip he'd tossed out of Urahara's window. Instantly, everything Kisuke had told him about flirting with Yoruichi and making her fall under his control completely slipped from his mind. Damn that Urahara. He knew she'd come back on him with something more intimidating. Well. Ichigo swallowed hard, trying his best to hold in his raging heart. Slowly, he walked over to her. Yoruichi was surprised that he'd even taken a step towards her, but she smiled all the while. He sat next to her, sliding his hand along her thigh. Yoruichi shivered, she hadn't expected that. Her eyes gazed into his, and slowly she reached out to him, pulling him down onto her. Ichigo's mind was racing. What to do? He was laying on top of the most beautiful woman. His hand lifted to stroke her, then he bent down, placing his on hers in a soft chase. Ho ho ho. Isin yelled as he fell through Ichigo's door. Ichigo jumped, falling off the bed and onto the floor with an oof. Seeing it coming, Ichigo stood quickly, grabbing his dad as Isin reached for Yoruichi. Dad. Ichigo shouted, annoyed. Yoruichi, however, didn't pay attention to the father-son quarrel. She sat up, pressed to her daddy fetter. Would you stop it already? Come on son, she looks a bit too old for you anyways. You can share her with your all pops. Arg, I said no. Ichigo shouted, turning to Yoruichi and grabbing her hand. If you're gonna keep hitting on her and spying on us, we're leaving. Isin sniffled slightly. Teenagers, dear, we were the same as them. Isin smiled, walking out of the room. With a sigh, Ichigo collapsed next to Yoruichi. As much as I love my dad, he's got to start giving me some privacy. Absent-mindedly, Yoruichi nodded, looking down at him with an expression. What is it? Ichigo asked, sitting up slightly. His mind reverted back to their momentary moment. Blushing, he looked outside at the rain, not quite sure what to say. We should give it another try. Yoruichi whispered, scooting closer to him. The boldness he'd had before was gone as he once again shied away, turning from her more. Perhaps some other time, she murmured, looking down. Why was she feeling so off? Is this what love was like? Well, tomorrow is another day. Ichigo yawned, pulling up the covers. Yoruichi nodded, laying back and yawning a bit herself. Remind me to kill Kisuke. It'll already be done by the time I can remind you. Ichigo mumbled, rolling his eyes at the advice Clogs gave him about making his favorite cat weak in the knees. It did make her weak, but it only fueled her drive. Which wasn't fair since Ichigo was a virgin, in every sense of the word. Knowing him, he's got something up his sleeve. We'd best watch out for him, wouldn't want either of us to end up looking like fools in the end. Right, I'd much rather keep the baddest reputation. Mumbled Ichigo, his eyes closing. Hey Ichigo? Yoruichi asked, glancing over at him. He shifted his body to let her know he was listening. You have school tomorrow, right? Ichigo had almost forgotten that he returned to school the next day. Opening his eyes, he glanced down to her, nodding. Yeah, I almost forgot. He sighed, listening to the rain once again. Yoruichi stirred. Do you think I could attend class with you? She asked, her voice low. Ichigo thought for a moment. There wouldn't be any harm to it. Keigo had probably already informed everyone about his false relationship with Yoruichi. I don't see why not. He said, looking over at her. But you'd have to behave yourself there. Yoruichi smirked, winking at him. It appears I'm not the only one who has to behave now. Ichigo flushed. Hey, Clog said you'd become tongue-tied and I'd have the upper hand. You can have the shower first, I'll go get us some breakfast. He said, grabbing a shirt and throwing it on and quickly walking downstairs, hiding the dark blush on his face. Soon, Ichigo Yoruichi smirked, walking into his bathroom and starting a nice hot shower. So, Ichigo, when can we be expecting a little niece or nephew? Karen asked, eating her toast. Ichigo, who had been drinking some milk, choked and spit his milk all over his dad, who jumped up and down excitedly. Oh. I'm going to be a grandfather. Do you hear that? Dirisan yelled, running to the huge memorial of his late wife. Ichigo gritted his teeth, throwing his carton of milk and hitting his father in the head, effectively knocking him down. Would you guys give it a rest? Ichigo growled, grabbing his and Yoruichi's plate of food, retrieving another milk carton for the two of them. It's bad enough I'll have to deal with Keigo and the guys in class today. He murmured, walking up the stairs, ignoring Isan's cries of joy. Ichigo stood outside his door, praying she was fully clothed. Slowly, cautiously he opened the door. To his surprise, she was dressed in the school uniform, sitting on his bed, looking outside. Ichigo couldn't help but take a moment to glance her up and down as she stood, smiling at him. Her skirt rose just above her knees, concealing her mid-thighs. The shirt, which she had to leave a couple buttons undone at the top, hugged her curves perfectly. Ichigo smiled, setting the food down on his desk. So? How do I look? She twirled, her hair hanging. Ichigo didn't trust his voice, so he only nodded, smiling more. After a few moments, he cleared his throat, handing her her plate. You look great, Yoruichi. A light blush lit up her face as she bit into her toast. Ichigo finished his plate quickly, grabbing a change of clothes as he headed for the shower. If Keigo comes by, ignore him. I'll be out in a few. He said, shutting the door and sighing. It was becoming quite hard to be near her. Just as Ichigo suspected, Keigo showed up, yelling for Ichigo. Yoruichi popped her head out of the window, smirking as she glanced back to the bathroom door. Keigo saw her, his eyes immediately sparkling with that same pervertedness. We'll go down shortly. She said, winking. We're kinda busy. She smirked, closing the window. Keigo ran a hand through his hair. Ichigo, you're so lucky. He sighed, grabbing his umbrella and leaning against a tree. Back up in Ichigo's room. Yoruichi waited patiently on his bed, glancing around at the few pictures he had. Finally, he came out dressed in his own uniform. He grabbed his bag, handing one of his older ones to her. Well, let's go. Yoruichi followed closely behind him as they stepped outside his house, Keigo smirking all the while. Ichigo shook his head, grabbing his umbrella and opening it, holding it over his and Yoruichi's head. Yoruichi, playing her part, leaned into Ichigo, grabbing his upper arm and pulling it to her. Keigo failed to notice Ichigo's blush as he walked behind Yoruichi, smirking more. If you look at her ass one more time, the only thing you'll be eating all day is my fist. Ichigo said aloud, his attention still focused on the road ahead of them. Keigo sighed, walking beside her now. That's even worse. Ichigo warned, leading her across the bridge. With another sigh, Keigo appeared beside Ichigo, his head hanging. "And I just take one look at Ichigo. How stupid of him to ask such a thing." As Ichigo quickly brought out his fist and slugged Keigo. With tears in his eyes, Keigo sniffled. "So unfair." He sighed, shoving his hands in his pockets, forgetting his umbrella on the ground behind him. Throwing his head back, he held his hands in the air. "Why am I cursed?" he shouted to the sky, falling to his knees. "Ah!" he cried. Keigo looked up to see Ichigo and Yoruichi looking down at him with raised eyebrows. "What the hell are you doing?" Laughing, the perverted boy scratched his head. "Nothing at all," she said, walking once again. Yoruichi held Ichigo's arm just a bit tighter, watching Keigo with a close eye. It wasn't long until they'd arrived at school, and Ichigo's friends swarmed around him and the dark-skinned beauty just as they walked through the classroom door. "Wow, Ichigo, you champ," one yelled from the back of the class. Ichigo noticed a few guys eyeing her, in which he responded by wrapping his arm around her and pulling her to him. Like hell he was going to let any other guy touch her. What? Ichigo thought, glancing down at the top of her head, watching her as she smiled and greeted his friends, leaning into him all the while. "Do I really see her as mine?" Ichigo thought, blushing madly when she looked up at him smiling. "I was talking to Ichigo's dad and he says Yoruichi and Ichigo have already." "Have what?" Ichigo yelled, staring at Keigo. Keigo blinked twice before chuckling, scratching his head. Nothing." Ichigo turned his head for a moment, turning back to see Keigo whispering something to the other guys, their faces flushed as they glanced from Yoruichi to Ichigo. Seeing this as the perfect flirtatious moment, Yoruichi pressed into Ichigo more, nipping at his neck. She let out a deep throat chuckle as he blushed. Keigo and the others watched with wide eyes and gaping s. He really is lucky. Oh wow. Ah, yes. Oriham's devoted R stood in the doorway, her eyes shimmering at the sight of Yoruichi. "She's so beautiful," Chizuru said to herself, slowly advancing towards the cat. Orihime walked by her, Tatsuki gritting her teeth once she saw Chizuru, however, noticed that the proud lesbian had her sights set on someone else. Orihime, too, noticed the dark-skinned goddess. "Yoruichi-san." The orange-haired girl smiled, running up to her former mentor. Yoruichi turned her head, her arms still wrapped around Ichigo. Yoruichi smiled, tugging at Ichigo to turn around with her. Orihime glanced from Ichigo to Yoruichi, a puzzled expression on her face. Seeing the arm Ichigo had draped around her shoulder and Yoruichi's around his neck, she pointed to them and turned to Chad, who had apparently been silently sitting in the desk beside Ichigo. Are we missing something?" Ichigo just sighed, though, allowing a smile as he opened his spirit energy wave, allowing mind communication. And yes. Telepathy. "No, we're not." Ichigo stated, however, Yoruichi replied differently, out loud. "Well, Ichigo and I are together," she said bluntly. Orihime looked confused for a moment, then nodded, feigning a smile. "Well, that's great," she said falsely. Chad stared at her, noting her mood change. "You're not being honest, Orihime." His voice was nonchalant like usual. Giving him a punch upside his head, Orihime laughed, walking off towards her desk and the awaiting Tatsuki. Yoruichi turned her head to see, letting go of Ichigo as he sat down on the desk in front of Orihime. I don't know their seating order, so I'm putting them where I want them." An odd sensation caused Yoruichi to turn her attention to the small girl fondling her. "Very nice," Chizuru whispered. Yoruichi set her hands on her, looking down at the girl questionably. "Chizuru. The girl's new and you're already feeling her up?" Tatsuki yelled from the back. Chizuru gave a slight laugh, blushing as she looked up at the taller woman. With a raised brow, Yoruichi smirked. Blushing more, Chizuru took her seat across the room, obviously intimidated by Yoruichi's goddess of a complex. Keigo sighed as he sat in his seat behind Chad, admiring Yoruichi. But then, a certain orange-haired well-endowed babe walked into the class with her short white-haired companion. "Ranjiku." Yoruichi smiled, watching as the captain and lieutenant sat in front of Ichigo. Ranjiku took her seat on her Taichu's desk, smirking as he gave an annoyed sigh. "So, what are you doing here, Yoruichi?" Smirking, Yoruichi took a place on Ichigo's desk, causing him to blush as he glanced at her long legs and exposed skin. Toshiro and Ranjiku looked to each other, then to Yoruichi, who just winked. As more students arrived, more guys gathered near Ichigo. "Come on, guys." Ichigo shouted, sitting back in his chair. Yoruichi remained silent as his friends took pleasure in staring at her. "Stop staring at her like she's on display," he said, annoyed, leaning forward once again. Wow. Mizuru drooled, his eyes shimmering like an innocent puppy dog. "She's gorgeous," he said absent-mindedly, sighing. Yoruichi felt the attention was amusing, however, the only person who she wanted to be mesmerized by was sitting back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. With a sigh, she stood, walking around the desk to sit on the other side of Ichigo. This caught his attention. "Is something wrong?" he asked, frowning when she just shook her head, her attention casted on an unrecognized boy in the front. Ichigo narrowed his eyes. He turned to Chad. "Who's the new guy?" he asked. "His name is Hirosaki Tachikawa. He transferred here from a school in the US a few days ago," Chad said, returning to the book in his hands. Ichigo scowled a bit when he saw the boy smile to Yoruichi, and what annoyed him more was when Yoruichi smirked back. Hirosaki began the short walk to Yoruichi's desk, smiling when he stood in front of her. Ichigo stiffened, noticing Yoruichi's open manner. "Hello, miss," Hirosaki said, grabbing her hand and singing it. Yoruichi smirked, glancing at Ichigo to see his expression. "My name is Hirosaki Tachikawa. I'm new here too." "It's nice to meet you, Hirosaki. I'm Yoruichi Shiun." Ichigo closed off his ears to the rest of their short convo. What was this feeling? He wanted to rip off that hero guy's head. Looking back to Yoruichi, he noticed her smile as she talked more with the young man who was now sitting in front of her. "Sorry bud, but she's taken," Ichigo blurted. His eyes masked any emotion, but Yoruichi could sense the jealousy. "Oh, really? I'm not surprised." Yoruichi blushed slightly, quite flattered. This caused Ichigo to feel even more jealous. Scooting his chair, Ichigo sat directly beside her, their desks together. He put his arm around her, narrowing his eyes. Yoruichi, to say the least, felt her heart quicken as she leaned into his side smiling. While the two boys had a stare down, the rest of the class took their seats as Ms. Masato stepped in. "Good morning, class. I'd like to introduce our Masato." Stopped, staring at Ichigo and Yoruichi. "Mr. Kurosaki, please." "HMPH." Ichigo gave Yoruichi a quick peck before scooting his desk back over. "As I was saying, we have a new student. Her name is Yoruichi Shiun. Welcome her, she will be here for the rest of the semester." The class smiled at her, the guys, of course, whistled. Ichigo kept his eyes on Hirosaki for the remainder of the morning classes. Finally, the lunch bell rang. "Finally." Keigo yawned, grabbing his things and waiting for his best friend Mizuru. "Hey bro, did you see the new hot eye?" he asked, smirking. They watched as Yoruichi stood, walking out alongside Ichigo. "I know, isn't our class great?" he sighed, eyes shimmering once more. "Oh, how wonderful high school is." "So, Yoruichi, would you like to eat lunch with me?" Hirosaki asked, paying no mind to the angry Ichigo. Yoruichi thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, why not?" She smiled, throwing Ichigo a glance before walking off with the black-haired boy. Ichigo grunted, following his friends up on the roof. "Your girlfriend blew you off, Ichigo, that's gotta be harsh," Keigo said, sipping his juice. Ichigo narrowed his eyes, forking his food. "How old is she?" Mizuru asked, staring at something from behind the roof's gates. Ichigo looked up. "None of your business, pervert," he said, standing. "What's down there?" he asked, peering down. Irritation rose once more as he saw Yoruichi sitting on a bench with Hirosaki. The two were laughing, obviously enjoying their lunch. "I think she's just been stolen from you," Chad said, standing behind Ichigo. With more annoyance, Ichigo waved his hand as he sat back down. "She was never mine to begin with," he confessed. Both Keigo and Mizuru looked at each other, then to Ichigo. "Keigo, I told you misunderstood us on the bridge. I was about to her, but you interrupted. It was a spur-of-the-moment kinda thing. And she's only staying at my place because she has no place else to go. But she hangs all over you," Totsuki said, approaching the boys with Orihime following closely behind. Ichigo glanced up, his eyes growing darker with loneliness. "She's just a tease," he said, mainly making it a point to tell himself. "She'll go out with any guy." Keigo raised his eyes, interest kicking in. Grinning, Keigo silently left, Mizuru following. Totsuki sat beside her longtime friend, her eyes downcast. "But Yoruichi-san does like you, Ichigo," Orihime stated, kneeling in front of him and eating her lunch. "When she was training Chad and I, she kept asking questions about you. Is it me she likes? Or is it the power that I have, or even my looks?" Ichigo asked, lifting his head. "Ow!" he yelped, glancing over at Totsuki as she planted her elbow in his ribsage. "What the hell was that for?" "For being an idiot," Totsuki said, standing. "Orihime, I'm going back to class now." "Oh, wait then. See you later, Ichigo." Orihime smiled, disposing of her half-eaten lunch and running after her friend. Standing once more, Ichigo stared down at Yoruichi. She didn't seem to notice him. Rain began to fall once more, causing the remaining kids to run for the school building. While the rest of Ichigo's friends retreated inside, Ichigo remained standing in that spot. He watched as Yoruichi ran side by side with the new guy, their arms touching briefly. Snarling, Ichigo kicked a small stone. "If you love her then tell her," Toshiro said from behind, his hands shoved in his stood humbly at his side, holding an umbrella above their heads. "I don't know what I feel." Ichigo turned, a small smile on his face. Ranjiku smiled, looking down at her captain. Then maybe you should do a little soul searching. The lieutenant said, turning her attention back to Ichigo. You're jealous when other guys hit on her, right? Ichigo nodded. And when she's near you, what do you feel? I get, but then, I just want to give in and make her yours. Toshiro finished, walking over and standing next to Ichigo. I felt the same as you. He said, glancing back at Ranjiku. The girl smiled, her eyes glistening. Ranjiku was always going for Jin, I didn't think I stood a chance. But then, I took that leap. Ichigo, if you love Yoruichi, it's the best she knows. We all know how she is. Unless she feels wanted, she won't stay around for long. Ichigo thought for a moment, then nodded smiling. You're right, I love the only problem is telling her. He chuckled, walking off and down the stairs. Ranjiku laughed, walking up beside her captain. You were wrong, Tashi. She said, smiling. I've been trying to get your attention, my captain. Laughing, Toshiro wrapped his arms around Ranjiku's, his face buried in her neck. Dropping the umbrella, Ranjiku wrapped her slender arms around her Taichu's neck, leaning her head down on his. She was grateful he'd gotten a few inches taller. You've always had it. Toshiro mumbled, pulling back to cup her in his hand. He caressed his thumb over her smooth skin, smiling as the rain began to shower them more. Wasting no more time, Ranjiku leaned down and pressed her gently against his, smirking when he pressed back. Yoruichi laughed loudly as she walked down the hallway with Hirosaki. Her shirt and skirt clung to her skin, causing several guys to whistle as she strode past them. Ichigo followed noticeably behind the two, giving evil glares to those who gave her a smirk. Slowly, he used his spirit energy to enhance his hearing, wanting in on their conversation. So, is that Ichigo guy really your boyfriend? He doesn't seem like it. Hirosaki began, looking over to her. She smiled slightly, shaking her head. With a sigh, she nodded towards their class and sat beside him. He's not, but I want him to be. I don't think he realizes how I feel about him. Yoruichi confessed. I don't even know what I really feel for him. I just know that I always want to be near him. Ichigo, he makes me feel safe. I can't really explain to God, I feel like I really am back in high school, she thought, looking to the floor. Ichigo silently walked in, giving her a warm smile as he took his seat near the window. For some reason, Yoruichi felt chills go up and down her spine, and she slowly stood. There he is now, I'll talk to you some other time, Hirosaki. Bidding the new guy a farewell, she began to make her way towards the orange-haired teen who had managed to capture her heart. Yoruichi. Keigo smiled, stepping in front of her. Yoruichi sighed, then smiled. I have a question to ask you. I'm listening. She said, leaning back on a desk, her head cocked to the side. Keigo stammered slightly, scratching his head. Well. Since you and Ichigo aren't really a couple, do you think you could go out with me later? Blushing brightly, the perverted teen glanced up and down her soaked body, his eyes bulging slightly. Seeing this as an opportunity to further irritate her Ichigo, she smiled and nodded, setting her hand on his shoulder. Sure, why not? Ichigo's attention was caught by the rise in her voice. He glanced over at them, his eyes immediately narrowing. Say after school. Keigo nodded like he had just won the lottery and walked off sighing as his eyes took on the shape of hearts. Chuckling, Yoruichi made the rest of the way towards Ichigo. She plopped herself down on his desk, smiling down at him. What was that all about? Ichigo asked, nodding his head towards the daydreaming Keigo. He's in high spirits all of a sudden. Oh, nothing. He just asked me to go out with him after school. And you said yes. His voice was more panicked than he'd wanted it to be. She nodded, raising an eyebrow. Yoruichi, Keigo's a pervert. She gave him an incredulous stare and pursued her. Never mind you being one, he is a major one. I can't believe you're seriously gonna go out with that hentai. My, Ichigo, are you jealous? Yoruichi smirked, leaning down, her face close to his. Ichigo sighed, leaning up and giving her a quick peck on the dot. Her eyes widened, a red blush appearing on her face. Glancing down, he'd his dot. Maybe I am. He whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. The classroom door slid open, causing everyone but Ichigo and Yoruichi to look up until. Hello, my name is Kisuke Urahara, I'll be your health professor from now on. Dun. Silence overfell the class, both Ichigo and Yoruichi nearly fell out of their chairs, well, in Yoruichi's case, off the desk. Their S dropped open as their eyes widened. Urahara winked towards them and opened a textbook. Now, if you'll please turn to page 349. I understand you're studying ul intercourse. If their faces were red before, they just turned a few shades darker as Ichigo glanced from Urahara to Yoruichi. I'll need a few volunteers, you two, near the window. Us? Ichigo asked, looking up at her once again. Urahara nodded, smirking all the while. Slowly, Yoruichi and Ichigo made their way towards the front of the class. Under his breath, Ichigo was silently cursing had and clogs. He knew he had something inappropriate prepared. Alright. Now, Kisuke began, clearing his desk off. If you lay down, Miss Shihuan and if Mr. Kurosaki here will get on you like so. What is this? Ichigo blurted. This isn't some porno class Mr. Urahara had and clogs, just wait till after school. Arg, damn you. Ichigo cursed more, his face red beyond a rose, and his energy furrowed in flames. This is a lesson, boy. Now both Yoruichi and Ichigo were thoroughly embarrassed as she laid back on the table, Ichigo getting in between her legs. Her skirt nearly revealed everything. The rest of the class remained silent, their eyes either bulging or faces redder than tomatoes. Kisuke explained things out further, keeping the two in an uncompromisable position. As for Yoruichi and Ichigo, they stiffened, staring into each other's eyes with racing hearts. Yoruichi smirked, extending her spiritual powers to talk telepathically with him. We should try this position at your place, Ichigo. She smirked, her golden eyes piercing his. His blush only darkened, even in this trying position she had to tease him. Yoruichi groaned, closing his eyes momentarily as she shifted a bit, smirking when she felt something hard pressed against her. Well. At least now I know you're attracted to me in more ways than one. Opening his eyes, he stared into hers, his breath tickling her face. The bell rang, unnoticed by the two of them. Ichigo, you can get off her now. Totsuki said, kicking Ichigo in the side. Sitting up, Yoruichi laughed as she slid out from beneath him. Totsuki walked away with Orihime, leaving Ichigo, Kisuke, Yoruichi and Chizuru alone. Hand clogs. Ichigo growled from his spot on the floor, lifting himself up only to see Chizuru advancing towards Yoruichi. Chizuru sighed, smiling as the dark-skinned woman smiled at her. Can I? She asked, lifting her hands. Blushing madly, Ichigo grabbed Yoruichi's hand. No, you cannot. He nearly yelled, walking out of the class with Yoruichi right beside him. Leave hand clogs to me. Ichigo growled, turning the corner. Yoruichi smiled. Well, schools are out now. He sighed, tossing his bag over his shoulder. Didn't you get that date with Keigo? Yeah. Yoruichi sighed, leaning against one of the windows. Will you be home later? She asked. Ichigo laughed. Where else would I be? He laughed, but in his mind he'd already decided he was going to follow them. Yoruichi was his girl now, even if he hadn't admitted his feelings to her yet. Even if she didn't feel the same for him. He was in love with her. But just what would happen during her date with Keigo he was going to find out, no matter what. Yoruichi, Ichigo said, following her up to his room. She started undoing her shirt, turning to him once they were behind his closed door. He paid no mind to the fact she was basically stripping before him. He was more concerned with her date with Keigo. Sure, she was a Shinigami, she had powers. But that wasn't the problem. He knew Keigo would advance on her and she just might take the little pervert up on his offer. You don't know what you're doing. I'm a big girl, Ichigo, I can take care of myself. She replied, turning from him and grabbing a nice low-cut shirt, hip-hugging jeans, and a midriff jacket from her bag. Besides, it's not like I'm yours or anything. She glanced back at him, her eyes narrowed. Ichigo looked down, his expression unreadable. He heard his bathroom door close and sighed when the shower came on. She was seriously going out with Keigo. Not yet, he mumbled, sitting on his bed. The rain had stopped, it was sunny now. He let his mind wander over the days she trained him in Soul Society. Ah, yes. One of his favorite memories. Although he'd be thoroughly embarrassed by their lack of clothing, he still enjoyed being so open with her. There were no expectations from her. She just wanted him to be himself, and in turn, she was hers. However perverted that might be, she was still a very intelligent and beautiful being. I wonder what her life was like before she died. Ichigo sighed, halting his thoughts as she came out. Hair up or down? She asked, brushing her long purple strands. Doesn't matter, you're beautiful either way. Ichigo murmured, still off in his own world. The gravity of what he said took its place in the air and silence fell upon them. Yoruichi smiled gently, walking over to him and sitting beside him. It's only a date, Ichigo. It's not like I'm marrying the kid. I don't even know him. That's the point. Ichigo sighed, turning to her. Yoruichi, Keigo is the world's most perverted teen. He'll try things with you. And since I'm always coming on to you, you think I'll let him take advantage? She cocked her head, raised her brow. You're so naive, Ichigo. Standing, she walked towards the door. You should have noticed that I've only come on to you. He scowled, folding his arms over his yeah. I'm just easy to tease. Yoruichi smirked, opening the door. She stood there a moment, then turned back to him. Don't wait up. She teased, winking to him. In a flash, she was gone. The front door opened and closed just as soon as he'd seen her flash step away. Sighing, he looked out his window, watching as she made her way towards his school. He felt something inside him crack and with a grunt, he stood, picking through clothes. He was going to follow them. And if Keigo tried anything, he better run like hell. Yoruichi. Keigo smiled as he spotted her walking towards him. He waved enthusiastically and held up a bouquet of flowers. Here. He said nervously. Yoruichi smiled, her golden eyes softening. He seems more sweet than perverted, she thought. Thanks. So, where are we going? She asked, walking beside him as he led her off school grounds. She noticed his wandering eyes and that look in his eyes that told her he was thinking of something. Well, I thought we could get some food. Keigo smiled, taking her hand. Do you mind? He asked, squeezing her hand. She glanced down, not really liking the fact of holding hands with him. She'd much rather be holding hands with Ichigo. Ah, yeah, she said, taking her hand from it and placing it in her pocket. Ichigo watched from behind a tree, keeping his distance, but keeping his ears and eyes open. Keigo sighed, slowly put his arm around her. Yoruichi stopped and looked down at him. Oh, sorry. Keigo laughed, folding his arms behind his head as he continued to walk. The two were silent and Yoruichi could just feel his eyes on her once again. She felt like asking him if he had a staring problem, but then again, when Ichigo stared at her, she didn't seem to mind at all. Ichigo's different from this creep. She said to herself. He doesn't do things I wouldn't want him to do. And he's much more of a gentleman about it. She smiled slightly at the thought, forgetting about Keigo. She hadn't even noticed that they were already at the small outdoor restaurant and he'd already begun ordering for them at the window. What do you want? Keigo asked, again. Yoruichi. Oh, some ramen. She smiled, sitting herself at a small table. Keigo smiled and brought over their food, sitting across from her. At least the rain decided to hold off. Keigo began, whatever else he had been saying was in one ear and out the other as Yoruichi ate in silence, her head in the clouds. I wonder what Ichigo is doing. She thought, drinking the last of her ramen from the bowl. Normally, she'd have eaten more, but she was with Keigo right now. Yoruichi. Huh? Quickly her eyes darted to the boy across from her. His eyes were slanted and she could feel his hand on her leg. Narrowing her eyes, she stood. I'm finished now. She stated. Walking off, leaving Keigo behind. Keigo frowned. Wait, Yoruichi. He ran up to her, sighing as he walked beside her. I'm sorry. It's just really pretty. Yoruichi saw he was, and smiled. Yeah, right. You're just trying to get some action, Keigo. Ichigo murmured, his eyes glaring at Keigo if looks could kill. Alright, let's go. Yoruichi smiled. Ichigo perked up. Go where? Damn, I missed that last part. Slowly, Ichigo stood and began running from tree to tree, trying not to be spotted. Several people stared at him, their faces in a WTF expression. Ichigo stopped and watched as they turned on Keigo's street. Why in the hell? Frustrated, Ichigo ran across the street, hiding behind a wall, watching them walk towards Keigo's garage. Just why was she going there with him? As they stepped into his garage and the door shut, Ichigo crept up to the door, his ear pressed against it. You can't fit it in there. Ichigo recognized Yoruichi's voice. His eyes widened slightly. It won't go in, Keigo grunted, causing Ichigo's heart to quicken. He heard a few more grunts coming from them, then he heard Yoruichi's voice. Finally. To Ichigo, it sounded like a breathless sigh. Now, harder. She said, her voice strained. Rain started to pour, Ichigo hadn't even realized the sky had darkened. His head hung, his expression unreadable. Clenching his fists, he gritted his teeth. What if Keigo had taken advantage of her? Looped her up with drugs? What if she'd forgotten all about him? But these thoughts in mind, Ichigo burst through the door. Stop. He shouted, his eyes closed. Yoruichi and Keigo looked surprised. Ah, Ichigo? She asked, standing. Ichigo's eyes opened to see the two standing beside a bike. Keigo was working on the pedals. What are you doing here? She asked, tilting her head. Ichigo sighed and walked out, shoving his hands in his pockets. A few moments later, Yoruichi was beside him. He remained silent as they crossed the street into the park. The rain seemed to not bother them. Were you following me? Her voice was soft, a hint of curiosity surrounded her words. Yeah, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. He sighed, his eyes downcast as he hung his head. Yoruichi waited, she knew there was more. I thought that Yoruichi smiled, taking his hand. You thought that he'd taken advantage of me? He nodded his head. Oh, Ichigo, Yoruichi whispered, pulling his arm to her. Ichigo glanced down at her head as she leaned on his shoulder. You mean you're not mad? He asked, looking down at her. She smiled, nuzzling his arm. Why would she be mad? She loved him. Her eyes widened, her heart stopped. Was it true? Was this an immense feeling of love? I'd understand if you were. I did kinda invade your personal life. I'm not mad, Ichigo, she said, glancing up at him. I'm flattered that you are protective of me. She had to keep her calm if she wanted to conceal her feelings. The two stopped for a moment, just gazing into each other's eyes. We should get home, Ichigo began, the rain beating down on them. He looked over her soaked clothes, smiling gently. We'll both catch colds. Yoruichi glanced down at herself, then to him and nodded. I'm surprised you didn't come on to him. Now Ichigo, you know you're the only one I come on to. She smirked, pulling his arm more. Ichigo blushed, scratching the back of his head. Besides, he's too short for me. Oh, so you like tall guys? I'm not Ranjiku. She chuckled, nudging him slightly. He let out a small chuckle, shrugging. Anyways, what about you, Ichigo? What about me? What's your type of girl? Ichigo thought for a moment, then smirked, looking down at her as they neared his house. Stopping, the two stood out front, facing each other. He studied her for a moment, wanting to place her description in perfect words. His jaw clenched as he raised his hand to put her hair behind her ear. She smiled, looking up into his eyes, her golden orbs glowing. Well, I'd prefer someone who was smart enough to make me feel dumb. I want her to be beautiful, not just on the outside, but on the inside. She has to see me, for who I am. I'd like for her to be a bit shorter than me, and for her to have a great personality, funny and all. His hand slid to her, caressing her wet skin softly. I want her to have golden eyes and purple hair. I want her skin to be dark and her alias to be a black cat. Yoruichi's eyes widened, her heart singing. Ichigo smiled, stepping closer to her. You know, someone like you, Yoruichi. Yoruichi was speechless. Never before had she felt this feeling, and right now, that feeling had her at a loss for words. For a moment, all she heard was the sound of the pouring rain, her and his breaths. Slowly, she smiled, grabbing the front of his shirt and pulling him down to her. His hovered over hers, their eyes closed slightly. Then why haven't you had me yet? She purred. As if something had snapped inside him, Ichigo wrapped his arms around her, his crashing against hers. Yoruichi let out a throat as she wrapped her arms around his neck, wringing him hard. The sound of thunder echoed in their ears, but neither pulled away. The rain fell on them, causing them to shiver. Ichigo parted her, his tongue seeking hers. Gladly, she allowed entry and encircled their tongues, once again. Her head was spinning, she had never felt so high from a dot, and right now, Ichigo was making her soar. Her heart fluttered at his touch, and her body sparked to life from his dot. She was on cloud 9. Ichigo, likewise, was reeling from all the sensations he was feeling. He never wanted to let her go. And he didn't. Telepathically, he spoke to her. I'm never letting you go, Yoruichi. You're mine now. She smirked behind her, tilting her head slightly. Then claim me, Ichigo. Her voice was husky in his head, causing him to shiver. I plan on it. He promised her. Finally, the two Shinigami were getting what they had wanted all along. Each other. And though the cold November rain continued to shower them, the new couple continued to, both their hearts racing in anticipation of what was to come. The sun shone brightly through Ichigo's window, shedding its light on the lovers below. Yoruichi, like always, well, almost always, was the first to wake up. Her golden eyes opened slowly, only to be greeted by a bare, very toned and muscular body. Smiling, Yoruichi raked her hand up his, leaning up to play soft on his. Ichigo stirred, his eyes opening. Brown orbs met hers, causing them both to smile brightly. Hey there. Yoruichi greeted, her hand stopping on his. She fed her, giving a throaty chuckle when he grinned at her, leaning up to place a soft on her. Hey there, yourself. He said, sliding his arm up and down her side. She shivered, her eyes hazing over with desire once more. Ichigo knew how to work with her, just like she knew how to work with him. One small touch and they were set ablaze. Although they hadn't confessed their love, they expressed it in a physical way of bonding, much liked by Yoruichi. And Ichigo had to admit, he loved it. The feeling of being with her that way was indescribable, it exceeded any meaning. Last night Ichigo was amazing. The cat spoke, her voice husky and low. Ichigo gave her a cocky grin, rolling over and pinning her to the mattress, her hands intertwined with his. She lifted her legs, sliding them up and down his sides teasingly. I knew you wouldn't be able to resist me for long. She whispered as he fed her. Who can? It's definitely going to be hard not to think about your body now. He chuckled, in her neck. She laughed softly, biting her lip as she tilted her head, arching her back slightly. I'm just glad I got you. She said, her eyes closing slightly as his eyes drifted lower onto her collarbone. I've wanted you for so long. So have I. He confessed, pulling back to look her in the eyes. Ichigo, Yoruichi was unable to finish her sentence as a very unexpected Isin bursted through the door. Ichigo's face dropped. With wide eyes, Isin clasped his hands together, running in small circles around the room. Bad. Ichigo growled, pulling the covers up over him and Yoruichi, who smirked, her hands raking up Ichigo's back. Do you mind? Isin stopped, looking at his son with a heartfelt expression plastered on his face. Why son, what is there to be ashamed of? Sighing, Ichigo set his head on Yoruichi's shoulder. Could you respect my privacy from now on? Well, we're going to have to talk about this later. Isin smirked, practically skipping out of the room. Yoruichi chuckled, the rumble in her reverberating through his own. She wrapped her long legs around him once more, tightening her arms around his neck. Ichigo pulled back, his eyes looking apologetically into hers. "You'd think he'd grow up." Laughing, Yoruichi shrugged. She didn't mind the interruption, she quite liked the risks. Besides, there was something about Isen. He looked familiar to her, not to mention he had a strange aura about him. "He's your father, he's only looking out for you." "Yeah, well one of these days he's gonna walk in when we're actually doing something." The orange-haired teen blushed, looking away stubbornly. Yoruichi laughed, flipping them so she was on top, straddling him. She set her hands against his, looking down into his eyes with her signature smirk. She took a moment to search his eyes, smiling when she found her answer. "That's exactly why I fell for you," she whispered, leaning down and in his neck. Ichigo felt himself being lifted into the clouds once more, her soft, slightly moist doing a number on his senses. "You're stubborn, but caring. Arrogant, but kind. You're pretty damn cute and very sensual. You're passionate, strong, lovable," she purred, in the teen's neck, nibbling on his earlobe. "And most of all, you, Ichigo. You're everything I've looked for and I've finally found you." Feeling the need to express his own feelings for her, he flipped them again, chuckling at the surprised uff that came from her. He trapped her beneath him once more, his hands holding hers above her head, they're interlaced. Squeezing her hands, he pressed himself against her, eliciting a small desiring from her. Her eyes closed slightly, leaving small slits at which her golden orbs were visible. "Ichigo." Ichigo whispered, nuzzling her neck. "And that's why I fell for you. You're so open around me. You've let me into your life and you've shown me that I am wanted. You gave me my strength, my confidence. You fueled my desire to live." Yoruichi's breath hitched as he grazed the nape of her neck. "You're so beautiful, so why? You're funny and you understand me. I can't say many people have seen me for who I really am. I can't say people have accepted me the way you have." Pulling back, Ichigo looked into her eyes, everything he felt for her becoming visible. "Yoruichi." "Ichigo." Karen's voice caused them both to turn their heads towards the door. "Would you two put some clothes on?" she yelled, shutting her eyes as she slammed the door shut. "Dad wants you downstairs stat." Left in silence, both Ichigo and Yoruichi looked back at each other, shrugging. "We'll need to find a new place." Ichigo murmured, getting off of his goddess and starting to pull on his boxers. A small, smooth hand reached out to grab his own. Yoruichi smirked, leaning on his back as she held his neck. Shivering, Ichigo grinned, grabbing her hand and pulling her into his lap. "Why don't we take a shower first?" She purred seductively, caressing his jawline. Grinning impishly, Ichigo picked her up, the two laughing all the while as they entered the shower. Loud s soon erupted from the room, causing the family members downstairs to cringe in disgust. You think Ichigo could be a bit more discreet?" Karen groaned, plugging her ears. Yuzu nodded her head, pouting as she covered her head with a pillow. "Yeah, Ichigo could have taken her to a hotel or something." Now, my little girls. That is the sound of love." Isen sighed, smiling as he lit candles near Misaki's shrine. Just what was he planning to say to Yoruichi and Ichigo, and just what did Yoruichi recognize about him? Who is Isen Kurosaki? Yoruichi sat beside Ichigo on his living room couch. Across from them sat Isen, his eyes darting from his son to the dark-skinned beauty. Something about Isen caught Yoruichi's eye. She couldn't quite lay her on it, but she knew there was definitely something in the air. She was getting a strange vibe, almost like she got from most of the higher-level captains at Soul Society. Brushing off the sensation, she leaned back, her hand grasped in Ichigo's. "So, how serious is your relationship?" Isen interrogated, raising his eyebrow as he leaned forward. Ichigo sighed, annoyance apparent. "It's serious enough." Ichigo sighed, narrowing his eyes. "How is that when you just started your relationship?" This caused the couple to glance at each other. They were aware that he thought they were together from the start. "Ah, you see, nothing gets past me, no matter how dumb I look." Yoruichi waited a moment, then looked into Isen's eyes. "Ichigo and I are fairly involved. I can honestly say, I want to be with forever." The cat smiled, squeezing Ichigo's hand. Isen seemed happy with the answer as he stroked the beard he had, folding his arms over his dot. "Your name is Yoruichi Shihuin, correct?" Yoruichi's eyes narrowed. "No doubt one of the noble's daughters." Ichigo's eyes widened, his breath caught. How did his dad know about that? "It's quite the honor." Isen grinned. Yoruichi's glare never faltered as she nodded her head. She closed her eyes momentarily. "Now I remember," she said, opening them slowly. Her golden eyes glowed with realization. Isen Kurosaki, captain-level Shinigami. "What?" Ichigo felt his entire face go pale, his heart stopping and his dad, "You're a Shinigami, yes." Ichigo glanced from his dad to Yoruichi, his face completely blank. "Don't look so surprised, Ichigo. Where do you think your power comes from? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Ichigo rasped out, his hand leaving Yoruichi's as he grabbed his father by the front of his shirt. Don't you think I have a right to know? Ichigo. Yoruichi said softly, setting her hand on his arm. Ichigo glanced at her, his anger subsiding as he let his dad go. Isin, we should talk more later. For now, I need to clear Ichigo's head. Nodding, Isin watched as Yoruichi coaxed Ichigo out of the house. He sighed. He hated to break the information so suddenly, but he had no choice. What he'd just learned from Urahara, things were going down and fast. His son had to know the dangers he faced. Yoruichi grasped Ichigo's head in her hands as she looked up into his eyes. The rain poured down on them, their bodies already soaked. Ichigo kept averting his gaze, not wanting to look her in the eyes. He was too angry. That little bit of information sparked a rage within him. This whole time, all of his life, his dad was a Shinigami. A Shinigami. How could he have not known? Why hadn't Urahara said anything? Ichigo. Her voice grabbed his attention. Look at me. She demanded. Ichigo's eyes shifted to look into hers. You need to calm down. We have to listen to what Isin has to say. He keeps in touch with Kisuke often, he might have some news. And seeing as how serious he got, I'd say the news is pretty bad. There's no time to stop and think about it now. All my life Yoruichi, all my life, and I never knew. I never knew that my own father hunted and killed Hallows. I never knew my dad was hundreds of years old. Do you know how shocking that is to me? Yoruichi gave him a sweet smile, her thumb stroking the spot just above his bone beneath his eyes. I know. It's a lot to handle considering the fact that we just finally gotten together. But, you have to keep yourself in control. You know there's that dormant Hallow within you. We first need to find out what's going on. We'll discuss the rest later. I don't know Yoruichi. Right now, I'm not sure I'm fit to stay calm. Smiling, Yoruichi leaned up and fed him. Ichigo thought about pulling away, but the thought quickly escaped him as he wrapped his arms around her and held her back. Her arms slid around his neck, pressing into him. That's one way to calm me down. Ichigo smirked, rubbing his hands up and down her back. Water droplets dripped off the ends of her hair. She edged her, smirking as she ran her hands through his hair. That's why I'm here. To make sure I keep your ass in check. And I'll gladly return the favor. He grinned, pulling her against him more. Glancing to his house, he sighed. Ready to try this again? He began to move for the door, but she stopped him, reaching out to grab his shirt. She pulled him down to her, crashing together passionately. Several minutes later, they pulled apart. I love you. She whispered, her eyes half open as she stared up at him. Ichigo smiled, his heart doing F in his dot. I love you too. His voice was low and husky, much liked by Yoruichi as he leaned down for another dot. The sun shone brightly through Ichigo's window, shedding its light on the lovers below. Yoruichi, like always, well, almost always, was the first to wake up. Her golden eyes opened slowly, only to be greeted by a bare, very toned and muscular body. Smiling, Yoruichi raked her hand up his, leaning up to play soft on his. Ichigo stirred, his eyes opening. Brown orbs met hers, causing them both to smile brightly. Hey there. Yoruichi greeted, her hand stopping on his. She fed her, giving a throaty chuckle when he grinned at her, leaning up to place a soft on her. Hey there, yourself. He said, sliding his arm up and down her side. She shivered, her eyes hazing over with desire once more. Ichigo knew how to work with her, just like she knew how to work with him. One small touch and they were set ablaze. Although they hadn't confessed their love, they expressed it in a physical way of bonding, much liked by Yoruichi. And Ichigo had to admit, he loved it. The feeling of being with her that way was indescribable, it exceeded any meaning. Last night Ichigo was amazing. The cat spoke, her voice husky and low. Ichigo gave her a cocky grin, rolling over and pinning her to the mattress, her hands intertwined with his. She lifted her legs, sliding them up and down his sides teasingly. I knew you wouldn't be able to resist me for long. She whispered as he fed her. Who can? It's definitely going to be hard not to think about your body now. He chuckled, in her neck. She laughed softly, biting her lip as she tilted her head, arching her back slightly. I'm just glad I got you. She added, her eyes closing slightly as his eyes drifted lower onto her collarbone. I've wanted you for so long. So have I. He confessed, pulling back to look her in the eyes. Ichigo, Yoruichi was unable to finish her sentence as a very unexpected Isin bursted through the door. Ichigo's face dropped. With wide eyes, Isin clasped his hands together, running in small circles around the room. Dad. Ichigo growled, pulling the covers up over him and Yoruichi, who smirked, her hands raking up Ichigo's back. Do you mind? Isin stopped, looking at his son with a heartfelt expression plastered on his face. Why son, what is there to be ashamed of? Sighing, Ichigo set his head on Yoruichi's shoulder. Could you respect my privacy from now on? Well, we're going to have to talk about this later. Isin smirked, practically skipping out of the room. Yoruichi chuckled, the rumble in her reverberating through his own. She wrapped her long legs around him once more, tightening her arms around his neck. Ichigo pulled back, his eyes looking apologetically into hers. "You'd think he'd grow up." Laughing, Yoruichi shrugged. She didn't mind the interruption, she quite liked the risks. Besides, there was something about Isin. He looked familiar to her, not to mention he had a strange aura about him. "He's your father, he's only looking out for you." "Yeah, well one of these days he's gonna walk in when we're actually doing something." The orange-haired teen blushed, looking away stubbornly. Yoruichi laughed, flipping them so she was on top, straddling him. She set her hands against his, looking down into his eyes with her signature smirk. She took a moment to search his eyes, smiling when she found her answer. "That's exactly why I fell for you," she whispered, leaning down and in his neck. Ichigo felt himself being lifted into the clouds once more, her soft, slightly moist doing a number on his senses. "You're stubborn, but caring. Arrogant, but kind. You're pretty damn cute and very sensual. You're passionate, strong, lovable," she purred, in the teen's neck, nibbling on his earlobe. "And most of all, you, Ichigo. You're everything I've looked for and I've finally found you." Feeling the need to express his own feelings for her, he flipped them again, chuckling at the surprised off that came from her. He trapped her beneath him once more, his hands holding hers above her head, they're interlaced. Squeezing her hands, he pressed himself against her, eliciting a small desiring from her. Her eyes closed slightly, leaving small slits at which her golden orbs were visible. "Ichigo." Ichigo whispered, nuzzling her neck. "And that's why I fell for you. You're so open around me. You've let me into your life and you've shown me that I am wanted. You gave me my strength, my confidence. You fueled my desire to live." Yoruichi's breath hitched as he grazed the nape of her neck. "You're so beautiful, so why? You're funny and you understand me. I can't say many people have seen me for who I really am. I can't say people have accepted me the way you have." Pulling back, Ichigo looked into her eyes, everything he felt for her becoming visible. "Yoruichi." "Ichigo." Karen's voice caused them both to turn their heads towards the door. "Would you two put some clothes on?" she yelled, shutting her eyes as she slammed the door shut. "Dad wants you downstairs stat." Left in silence, both Ichigo and Yoruichi looked back at each other, shrugging. "We'll need to find a new place." Ichigo murmured, getting off of his goddess and starting to pull on his boxers. A small, smooth hand reached out to grab his own. Yoruichi smirked, leaning on his back as she held his neck. Shivering, Ichigo grinned, grabbing her hand and pulling her into his lap. "Why don't we take a shower first?" She purred seductively, caressing his jawline. Grinning impishly, Ichigo picked her up, the two laughing all the while as they entered the shower. Loud S soon erupted from the room, causing the family members downstairs to cringe in disgust. You think Ichigo could be a bit more discreet?" Karen groaned, plugging her ears. Yuzu nodded her head, pouting as she covered her head with a pillow. "Yeah, Ichigo could have taken her to a hotel or something." Now, my little girls. That is the sound of love." Isin sighed, smiling as he lit candles near Misaki's shrine. Just what was he planning to say to Yoruichi and Ichigo, and just what did Yoruichi recognize about him? Who is Isin Kurosaki? Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe and comment down below and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the METALCHICKCRISIS2040 for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.